In the past two videos, I showed you how to create an LRGB image as well as a hydrogen alpha RGB image with your monochrome camera. But today we're going to be looking at narrowband photography. And this is pretty cool because you can take narrowband photos even in a downtown light polluted area or during the full moon. The way these narrowband filters work is that they block out all the wavelengths except the specific ones being emitted by the nebula that you want to photograph. And we'll get into that more later on, but this is of course the Rosette Nebula, taken with hydrogen alpha, oxygen, and sulfur filters. And if you're still new to this, I'd recommend going out checking some of the earlier videos in the course where I explain some of these differences. But as always, the first thing we want to do is stack our various color channels. So I'm going to go over to Deep Sky Stacker and we'll get started. First, we're going to go to Open Picture Files. And then, in this case, I only had about, 10 photos of hydrogen alpha. They were all 3 minutes long though, which is not too bad. And there's one of the frames I got. It was really cool too, because when you put on that hydrogen alpha filter, you can very quickly see the nebula within 5 or 10 seconds, and that helps you to find the object and get ready to go. And even the black and white photo here looks really nice. So that's kind of one of the fun things to do with narrowband. But moving on, once you've added in all your light frames with a filter, then we need to add in our darks and bias and flats if you have them. So I can click on dark files next, select in this case my 20 dark frames, and then for our bias frames, I took 200 last night. Remember, these are going to be the exact same settings as your normal photos, at least the dark frames anyway. You just put the lens cap on so no light reaches the sensor. The bias frames are just very fast exposures with the same gain with no light coming in. And there's plenty of other videos that explain that. But once you've added in your lights, darks, flats, and bias, if you have them, just come over to the left and hit check all. Now that everything is checked, what I want you to do is pick one of these photos, and this is going to be our reference frame for the rest of our stack. It doesn't matter really, just kind of glance over it and make sure the image is pretty sharp and there's a lot of stars. In this case, I'm just going to click on this particular light frame, and then I want to right click and hit use as reference frame. It's really important you do this whenever you're shooting with multiple filters, just so that way Deep Sky Stacker keeps all the stars in the same spot between your various filters. So once you've right clicked and hit use as reference frame on one of your light frames here, you're ready to continue on. Then we're going to go to register checked pictures over on the left. In this case, I know every single photo I took was sharp, so I'm going to use the best 100% of photos. If you're not quite sure though, put it to like 80 or 90 and it will automatically remove any of your bad photos. Then go to the Advanced tab and hit Compute Number of Detected Stars. It's going to go through, analyze the scene, and give you the amount of stars it finds. In this case, I think 1,000 is fine. There's probably that many there, so no worries there. And then the only other thing you have to do is go to Recommended Settings. It's going to give you suggestions. If they're blue, you can click on them and it will turn them on. In my case, I only took 10 light frames, so it's telling me to do median. Ideally, you'd have more than 10, but that's what we're working with tonight. Everything else looks good, so I'll hit OK. And then I'll hit OK again. This is our final screen before it's going to do the stacking, so you want to make sure you scan over everything, make sure your bias and dark frames and flats, if you have them, make sure they all match, and you don't see any red text. If everything looks good, double check how long your total exposure time was. In this case, only 30 minutes. Not exactly a lot, but enough for this tutorial. And then if everything looks good, we'll hit OK, and it's going to run through the processing. Okay, Deep Sky Stacker has finished processing. It probably only took a minute. And now what we're going to do is go over to the left and hit Save Picture to File. From here, I usually create a TIFF folder in my directory where I can drop all my stacks. And then we can name this Hydrogen Alpha in this case, and then hit Save. Make sure you have embed adjustments, but don't apply them, just to be safe as well. Once you hit Save, we've now stacked our hydrogen alpha. We need to do the same thing for oxygen and sulfur. If you go back to the register and stacking, the very top left, bring you right back to the start. From here, we need to get rid of our hydrogen alpha frames, but you want to keep the reference frame. And if you look very closely here, you'll see that there's a little asterisk, which designates that that's my reference frame. So don't get rid of that one, just get rid of everything else. And I'm just going to hold down the Shift key and then delete my light frames here. Once you've removed all your light frames except for the asterisk reference frame, you can turn the little check mark off for that. And if you right click on it, it should still say use as reference frame. You don't want to click off that, just make sure it says that. And again, the whole reason we're doing this is because the stars will drift usually between your different sets of photos. When you include the reference frame, though, it will make sure that each stack of photos has the stars in the exact same spot. That will make your life a lot easier in the next part of our workflow. All right, so we're good here. Now I'm going to go back up to open picture files. We did hydrogen alpha. Now we need to do oxygen. And I only had about 7 of those. And in this case, it loaded them at the very bottom. So I'm going to click on the first one, click on the last one, holding down the shift key, and then check those. And I know in this case, one of these photos was blurry. So I need to go through and delete that one. And you can see even the clouds started to come in and ruined, maybe not ruined, but affected the shot. See that one? It was noticeably blurrier. And if you look in the top left, you'll see that there's some blur. That's because I walked out on the patio and shook the tripod. Now that I know this is the blurry photo, I can come down to my list, uncheck it, and then right click and remove it from the list. Now I know the rest of these are sharp. However, one of them was noticeably worse. I guess they're all noticeably worse. That first one was the best. What I was going to say is that if you see that some are worse than the others, you might want to get rid of them as well. And this is the exact same settings as the hydrogen alpha filter, but let's compare them just so you have an idea. So this is oxygen versus hydrogen alpha. See how much more detail you get there? And that's going to be true with a lot of the nebula in the night sky. So personally, I really focus on hydrogen alpha at the start of the night. That way, if nothing else, at least I got the good data. And then the not so great data, it's not a big deal if I didn't get as many. That's the way I think of it anyway. But once you've loaded in all of your, in this case, oxygen frames, you've removed any bad ones, we're going to repeat that process. We're going to go to register checked pictures. If you're still not sure if they're all sharp, you can do the best 90. In this case, I double checked, so I'm going to do the best 100. Then it's always a good idea to come back to your advanced tab and click compute number of detected stars. Just make sure it doesn't find 0 or like 12,000. In this case, we're fine. Then go to recommended settings, verify everything looks good. It does. So we'll hit OK. We'll hit OK again. And it's telling me I have about 21 minutes. That's decent, but again, it's always better to get a lot more exposure time. So I'd hit OK. It's going to run through and process. Once it's finished, we're going to be back in this screen. Then you go save picture to file and name this one oxygen. Then we go back to register and stacking, get rid of all the oxygen photos here at the bottom. And then finally we'll add in our sulfur images. And this is really where things got bad for me because I got, 4 photos? And if we take a look at them, they're not good. So here's the very first sulfur. You can hardly even see anything there. And then after that, the clouds started to come in, got hazier. And then it was just so much hazier because of the clouds. So that photo you saw at the start of the video, that was actually only with a single sulfur photo because the rest were just too cloudy. And that's 3 minutes worth of data. Not exactly a lot, but it still turned out to be a cool shot. So hopefully you have much better luck than me. You add in all your sulfur images, check them all, make sure they all look good. And then don't forget, we still need to have that reference frame, in this case, still at the top of our photo. That's what's going to allow us to make sure all our stacks are aligned. So repeat that process, register, okay. Yeah, 12 minutes, realistically 3. Once that's done and you've saved it as sulfur, then we're ready to head over to Photoshop. And in my case, I'm just going to close out a deep sky stacker. And then we'll go to my TIFF folder I created. From here, I have hydrogen alpha, oxygen, sulfur. I can load them all up, and it should bring me right into Photoshop. Thankfully, you already know the process by now if you watch the other videos. The only difference is we're not working with RGB anymore. We're working with hydrogen alpha, oxygen, and sulfur. And this is where you have a lot of flexibility. because you can map those to any color channel you want. However, there are some recommended ways to do things. So once we get everything set up here, let's talk about those differences. As always, the first thing we want to do is choose one of these to become our base, if you will. It doesn't matter which one you pick, but I'm going to go with hydrogen alpha today. Once you've picked your base photo, we're going to go up to Image, Mode, and change it from grayscale to RGB color. That way we can paste in the various color channels. Now that this is an RGB image, we can go to Channels over on the right, and we have red, green, and blue. At this point, you can choose any color spectrum that you'd like. The most common, though, is the Hubble Palette. This apparently tends to show the most detail, although the colors aren't at all what you would actually see. It's not realistic in that sense, but you can still get some cool photos. And if you want to do the Hubble Palette, the way this is going to work is the hydrogen alpha is going to be on the green color channel. The oxygen is going to be on the blue color channel, and the sulfur is going to be mapped to red. So if you'd like to follow along with that, what we're going to do, if we have our hydrogen alpha, if that was our base, then green's already taken care of. So we need to grab red and blue. Oxygen is going to be blue, so we'll come over to here, hit Control A, Control C to copy everything. Go back, make sure you only have the blue layer selected, or the channel rather, and then we'll hit Control or Command V to paste that data in. All right, so we've got green and blue. Now we just need to grab red, which is sulfur. So we'll hit Control A, Control C, and then paste that in right here. And because we use those reference frames, or rather the one reference frame in Deep Sky Stacker, as I go through these layers, you can see that they don't move at all. If you forgot to do that, though, they're going to be moving all over the place, and you have to manually come in here on each color channel and use your arrow keys to align them. And I explained that in the LRGB tutorial here on YouTube, if you want to go see that. But in this case, everything lined up properly. Once you've mapped out your color channels, again, today we're doing Hubble Palette, we can go back to our layers and then begin stretching the image. The best way to do that is to come up here to our adjustments. And if you don't have this window, go to Window, Adjustments, and it will pop up somewhere. This is just one way to do things. Works for me anyway. But we'll add a levels adjustment right here. And then we're going to move the midpoint here, the gray point, to the left. And there we can see the Rosette Nebula coming out very nicely. Once you've brightened it up quite a bit, we'll go back to our adjustments. And as you might have learned here, Photoshop makes everything very pixelated for some reason. So if you hit Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E, that will fix that problem. It's just kind of a workaround for now. Then we'll go back to our levels and add a new one. So I'm going to add another levels adjustment and keep stretching that histogram, just like that. In this case, I only needed 2 today. Sometimes you will need more though, depending on how dark your photo was. If that still wasn't enough, we'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E, go back to our adjustments, add another levels, and just do it until you get a lot of that detail coming out. Finally, we'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E again, and now you can delete these other 2 layers. You don't need them. There we go. So now we just have our levels, and then our final layer on top. And the only reason we're doing this again is because without this Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E thing, it's going to look like this, really pixelated and weird. So that's why we're doing that. But there we go. Remember, this is about 30 minutes of hydrogen alpha, which is that main detail, about 20 minutes of oxygen, and like 3 minutes of sulfur light. And that's why it probably could look a little bit better. The more light you capture, the better. But you know, when you think about it, that's pretty clean and detailed for how little time I had. And, you know, I've never once gotten a Rosette photo I was happy with until last night. So that's a pretty good starting point there. And I want to take a minute here and stress that this is the Hubble Palette, this is the one NASA uses, but you can do anything you want here. And if you come back to your channels and go channel by channel, you can see exactly what you captured. So this was the oxygen, hydrogen alpha, and that 3 minutes of the sulfur, hardly anything at all there. But you can feel free to map out those colors any way you want. Maybe you want to put hydrogen alpha on the red color channel and oxygen on the green channel and sulfur on blue. You can do whatever you want. It helps to just go in here, experiment, and try things. But I'd recommend starting off with a Hubble Palette just so you can get these basics down. All right, so once you've mapped the colors however you'd like, we can go back to our layers right here. And at this point, it's entirely up to you whatever direction you want to take the photo. For example, I can add a selective color. It's going to be bottom row, second from the right here. And then when this tool comes up, we can choose any of the color channels. And I think this is actually the first time I've ever had green in my photos at night, at least deep space. So this is the first time I can actually use the green color channel here. But then what you would do is just move these sliders left and right. And a lot of the times when you see the Hubble Palette, it's going to have like this kind of yellowish tinge to it rather than the real emerald green mine had. But again, it's entirely up to you, whatever route you want to take these colors down. For me, I want to make this dust and the clouds and everything stand out more. So if that means it's going to be more yellowish, maybe I'll do that. I mean, these are false colors, so it doesn't really matter what you do as far as I'm concerned. Do what you want to make it look good. But the best way to do that is to start off here on selective color and then go down channel by channel. Most of them probably won't have any impact, but if we go to cyan, that might target right in here. So I can move it left and right, and that's definitely having a noticeable impact there. Once you've messed around with selective color as much as you like, then another thing to try is going back to your adjustments and using the hue and saturation tool. That's going to be middle row on the far left. The way the hue and saturation tool works is that you can target the entire image at once and then just move the hue around. But if you do that, you're going to get really weird results and it's going to get very grainy very quickly. So I don't recommend doing it on the master option right here. I would rather do it channel by channel, just like we were doing with selective color. With that said, let's start on greens here. I'm going to zoom out. Again, we're only affecting greens. Now we can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance. So I can move them left and right. Again, don't take these too far in any one direction. I wouldn't go probably more than plus or minus 20. And you might also want to zoom in to make sure you're not pixelating anything. But for me, I'm getting pretty clean results, and I like the color separation. If I go to the right, about plus 25, I can maybe add more saturation, although that looks pretty nasty. So I'm going to put it back to where it was. And then the lightness or luminance, you can make it brighter or darker. But as you're seeing here, it really starts to fall apart when you move things too far. So play it safe here and don't overdo it. But there's our first hue and saturation. It got that nice color separation between the greens and yellows and the blues. You could either now go where it says greens, drop down to cyans, and then change that. Or if you want to be safe, you can go back to your adjustments, add a new hue and saturation layer. And this way, if you do it this way, you can, turn down the opacity of each one of these changes rather than having them all merged into a single adjustment. And then again, what I'm going to do is go to cyans, just try changing the hue a little bit, saturation a tad. I think that's a good subtle change right there. Yeah. All right. And depending on the colors you have in your photo, you might be able to do different color channels or even move them further. So really spend some time here and see what you can do to really make these channels separate as much as possible. That's kind of what I'm going for personally, because I want to see this detail here. And that looks pretty cool. It's completely different than my first edit, but I think that looks nice. Once you're happy and you've done all these color changes, don't forget, we can always go back, add another selective color now, and have even more control over the image. And I could probably even now make use of the yellow color channel. Before it wasn't doing anything, but now we're really starting to get those kind of yellowish red colors out of there. And if I would have captured more data, this wouldn't look nearly as nasty as it does now. But the whole point I'm trying to get across here is that you should just keep going back and forth, adding more and more layers until you're happy with the final image. All right, that looks good there. One thing I'm going to show you, if I go back to my channels, click on the blue color channel. Well, the way we're going to have to do that is hit Control-Shift-Alt-E first. Or Command-Shift-Option-E if you're on a Mac. Now we can click on these. But see how grainy the blue color channel is? The green color channel, there's hardly any noise because that's all the hydrogen alpha data. And the red is really bad because this was only 3 minutes of data. So one thing you can try is reducing the color noise on these specific channels rather than the entire image. And if you want to give that a try, let's start off in this case with, I think, red. Red was the worst offender. Once you have just red selected, we go to Filter. And there's a lot of ways you can reduce noise. I'm actually probably going to try the Camera Raw filter today. I've never actually done this, so we'll go through this together and see what happens. Then I'm going to zoom in, go to the Detail tab, and then increase the luminance slider. And it's really not having too much of an effect here. So you can mess around with these different options, but frankly, I was hoping this would do more than it is. So if this is not working for you either, we can just cancel out of this. You know, you could go Filter, Noise, and try and reduce it that way. If you have some other third-party software, you could probably do that. But I just want you to be aware that you usually can go in here on these specific color channels and reduce the noise. I'll probably have to revisit this in a future tutorial. Because like I said, this is actually my first time trying that. But going back to the full color image, we'll just move on from here. Now that I have this top layer, and if you don't have it, hit Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E. I'm going to try and just get rid of the noise on the main image. For that, I'll go to Filter, Camera Raw filter, and then make sure I'm actually on RGB here. Before I actually still had red selected, even though everything was turned on. So you see they're all highlighted. Now if I do that, it should work properly. There we go. But we'll zoom in. Then we'll go back to the Detail tab, increase the luminance a little bit, and the color is really the big culprit right here. There's a lot of that color noise, mainly because I stretched the hue so far and I didn't have a lot of data. But at the very least, I can clean that up by moving the color slider right here. I think that's going to work fine. So then I'll hit OK. Yeah, it's still not great, but it's better than it was. All right, so we've reduced that ugly color noise. Haven't really lost too much detail though. Now what I want to show you is a cool sharpening effect that I've really never done before. And I want to thank my buddy Stu for mentioning this because I've heard about it, but I've never actually done it. So if you want to follow along, we're going to hit Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E. That'll create a new layer. Then I'm going to name this High Pass. From here, we'll go to Filter, Other, and High Pass. This is essentially going to bring out all that dust without really increasing any of the grain, which is a problem you get when you try and sharpen things conventionally. Once we click on High Pass, from here, you just want to zoom out and then adjust the radius so it's targeting those dust clouds. It's going to be different for everybody. I don't frankly know if there's a right or wrong way to do this because I've only done it on this particular image my first time. So right there I think looks pretty good, around 43, and then I'll hit OK. The only problem is it completely ruined the photo. So we have to change the blending mode here from normal. I'm going to try overlay, and you can feel free to do different options, you know, but overlay for me gives good results. And there's our before and after. See how kind of soft it was before? There was no punch to it. Now with that high pass filter, it really stands out. Yeah, I think it looks really nice. And that's probably why a lot of those guys out there have that real nice punchy effect I've never really gotten because I've never done a high pass filter before. But yeah, now again, we're running into the problem where that color noise is really starting to come back to bite us, which is why I warned you about stretching things too far with the hue. But again, if I would have just captured more light, this really wouldn't have been nearly as bad. And from here, nobody's ever going to know. So yeah, that high pass looks really nice. From here, there's not much more I want to do. We got a narrowband photo, and I think it looks pretty good. As always, you can continue to work on the image. You can add more and more selective colors. Just watch you don't go overboard. And the last thing I'm going to do is crop this in a little bit. Maybe like that. And then finally, I might add just a very little vignette. I'm using Raya Pro here from Jimmy McIntyre. This is a really good piece of software, especially if you're more into like landscapes and things like that. But there we go. I just added a big vignette. I can turn down the opacity. And now your eye goes right to that nebula there. And I think that looks really nice. Finally, we got to save this. So we'll go to File, Save As, and name this. You can name it whatever you want. And it's usually a good idea to put a little bit of compression here because we do have so many layers. I usually put LZW and then sometimes even zip to make the file smaller, but it's not a big deal. Once we've saved this TIFF file, now we can obviously save it as a JPEG. The way we're going to do that is go up to Image, Mode, 8 bits per channel, and then File, Save As, create a new folder if you haven't done so already for JPEGs, and then we'll throw that in there. And before we go, I just want to do a comparison and see how this compares to my very first edit. I'm kind of curious. So we've got my first draft here. It's very green, but it's not too bad. And this is more your traditional Hubble color palette where you have the yellows, the greens, and kind of the blues there. That's more what you're going to see online. But I don't know. They're both interesting. And that's the great thing about this hobby, especially narrowband, is you have complete artistic freedom to take this in any direction you want. Like I said, we used the Hubble palette today, but you can map these colors to completely different color channels and come up with completely different looking photos. So it's a lot of fun to just experiment and see what you can capture with your monochrome camera and narrowband filters.